You're listening to Biotech Hangout, a live and unedited weekly discussion of all the latest news, and boy, do we have news this week in our industry with a group of biotech insiders. I am Sam Fazeli from Bloomberg Intelligence, and my co-hosts today are John Maraganore and Nina Kjellson and Matt Gline, although I haven't found Matt yet, but I'm sure he'll be there soon. Um, for more information about our hosts and guest speakers, or to listen to the most recent episode, please go to biotechhangout.com. Now, we are we started the week with the executive order from President Trump, uh, essentially around the drug pricing story. This has been something that's been brewing in the US for years. Similar thing was tried in the previous time that President Trump was in the White House, and this time we have it in a slightly more fleshed out form, with several points that have been made in this executive order. The objective overall is to try and see if we can bring down US drug prices, or at least some of the US drug prices. Lots of things have been said. Share prices sold off really strongly. Um, and then they jump back up again. And actually, I think at least several pharma companies' stocks are back up on above what they were at the beginning of the week. There are several elements that I'm going to tease out very quickly and then get going with the team here. Um, if and you can change this if you want, folks. So there was the 30-day ultimatum, which I read in there. Go ahead, come to us voluntarily, and in that period, also HHS will be studying some drug prices and see what they can get. Then there's the 180 days that is during which the negotiations or conversations will be taking place to try and see if we can come to a view in terms of taking prices down. And interestingly, I would say this ties in very strongly or very closely to the time frame for the next IRA negotiations. There was a conversation about in the executive order about reimportation of drugs from other countries where the prices are lower, which would be interesting to talk about. There was a lot of talk about the unfairness of ex-US prices and how that's something that has to change, but would be nice to talk about whether there's any mechanism for this to happen. And then, of course, the element of direct-to-consumer sales, which we can talk about. So I'm going to turn to John first. You could take a pick at any one of those or an overall conversation, and let's just go.
Well, let me just start by saying that what I saw happen on Monday was not a most favored nation executive order, but a mostly fluff and nonsense executive order, to be crass. I mean, it was a very vague, very general, um, very nonspecific set of process related steps that I think and the market showed this. People were very anxious about this the prior week, and things were weighing on the sector, and over the weekend there was a lot of chatter that I was getting from my colleagues in the investment community and in companies, and then Monday morning comes and it comes out and it is just a nothing burger at the end of the day. Clearly this president is hell bent on some type of most favored nation mechanism. But this executive order, is the start. What's clear about it is it's the start of a negotiation, and I think that's why the investment community breathed a sigh of relief and calibrated what this actually is for what it is. It's the start of a long process, and where it ultimately goes remains uncertain at this point in time. I do think that ultimately this president, if he's way, will try to get some type of MFN mechanism in the industry, but it could be done in ways which is acceptable to industry, actually, whether it's done as part of the IRA, when everything is calibrated back at 13 years, or, if there's some other mechanism to maybe apply it to drugs that haven't been launched yet so that, US companies can calibrate this measure into future launches, not existing launches, et cetera. There's certainly going to be some ongoing discussion about it, but there was nothing about what happened on Monday that fulfilled people's worst fears. And that's why, appropriately, the sector has breathed a big sigh of relief during the course of the week.
Yeah, Nina, did you want to jump in here?
I wholeheartedly, agree with John's view that this is really a massive negotiation tactic. Although I don't like the stages of grief, I sort of feel like the industry is responding to these blows with a mix of denial and bargaining and distraction. And so I think taking MFN, alone is probably not as useful as taking it in the full context of also, tariffs threat, biosecurity section 232, IRA renegotiation, and then of course the big beautiful bill and the healthcare provisions that are embedded therein. But I think what the administration is trying to do is force pharma's hand to the table and also to continue to curry populist support. And it's working. I mean, 100 billion of committed U.S. investment into manufacturing and R&D facility by five of the top 10, six of the top 10 pharmas is a non-trivial amount. Now we'll see how much that sticks because pharma can negotiate as well and say, hey, maybe we won't make those investments in favor of, tariff relief or reduced MFN if this is going to continue to be coming at us, from all directions.
Right. And we do have Matt, so that's great to hear. Matt, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Good to be here. Look, I think, and by the way, John stole a word that I was going to use, which is nothing burger. I
Sorry, Matt.
no, it's all good. John, by the way, one of the reasons that I participate in Biotech Hangout is so that I could be on the same time as you someday, so that I could call you out for saying that Roivant would never be a great company in a newspaper
Oh
article.
man.
So
Oh man. Don't
I've been
do that.
waiting
I'm
for
so
this moment for
sorry.
years, and I thought that was very mean of you.
I'm sorry.
Thank you. Anyway,
It's just the one time that John was mean.
just the one time. Look,
Just
on MFN. Look, I think there's a few things here. One of which is a frustrating reality for the industry is that for all of the whirlwind of policy changes in in the administration that we've been sort of thinking through over the last month and a half or 2 months, this one is complicated because at some fundamental level, the administration is right. Right, that is like it is a bad fact for the industry that and for America, but I'm thinking like for the industry that prices are so different here versus other places. And in fact, the very thing we are dealing with now, which is massive gyrations in strategy and value based on US drug pricing, is itself evidence of the problem that needs to be solved. That is like we are at the whims of one person's tweets, mostly because US drug pricing is so disconnected from the rest of the world's. And that if we could somehow fix this problem, even if it meant a temporary or permanent bump along the road where things got reset from a value and return perspective, but then we got to grow in a more equitable and evenly distributed way, I think there's like some advantage to that world, although it would be a very painful path. I do think there's a lot of complicated risks hidden in this discussion. First of all, pharma's going to come to the negotiating table. I think the people most likely to be at that negotiating table are going to be big pharma CEOs and large commercial organizations representing a portion of the status quo and thinking a lot about their business. I'm a little bit worried biotech won't be as represented at that negotiating table and that our interests are slightly different. We're much more focused on future drugs than current drugs. We're much more focused on the way this plays out in different kinds of markets and in various aspects of the value picture. And so I'm a little bit worried about like how we get involved as an industry and make sure that like the longer term picture, which is how I would describe biotech interest, because necessarily the vast majority of our companies are either development stage or earlier in their lives, are represented. And then like I think a worry for the country and to some degree for Trump is I think gotten wrong, this policy will lead to higher drug prices in the US because people will start abandoning other jurisdictions, not worrying so much about MFN, and then just like pricing here to try and make up the delta. And so I think there's like a lot of complicated minefields in the actual negotiation that's about to take place, which, by the way, is like a much more cogent and interesting negotiation than anything on pharma tariffs, which is mostly, I think, correctly understood as a tax policy debate.
Right. I mean, Matt, pretty
Y-
much the
The,
entire tariff setup is a tax. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
called a tariff. A tariff is a tax, right? So,
yeah.
and
Can
I
I just say
think
one thing?
yes. Go ahead.
Can I just jump in on one thing? Obviously, aside from apologizing again to Matt, but on the topic of prices, I do think that we obviously have discrepancies in many cases between U.S. and foreign drug prices, but let's not forget that that happens up and down the healthcare system, whether it's MRIs, whether it's CT scans, whether it's mammograms, whether it's, I mean, name your procedure, U.S. versus rest of world, vastly different prices, much more expensive here. And so, it is an overall issue from a healthcare system standpoint. And you just can't ignore that. I mean, and nobody should, because our overall healthcare costs in general are higher. And I do agree with you, Matt. Obviously the industry, if to the extent that there is a negotiation, it'll likely be with the larger companies. I'm sure Bio will try to get as involved as possible and represent the smaller company voice, and I'm sure they'll do a good job with that as best as they can. But it will mostly be with the larger companies where there's money at the end. That's all there is to it.
By
Well,
the
and
way,
I
I
Yeah.
think the
think,
point about I think it's such a wonderful point about caring about the drugs of
yeah.
today versus the drugs of tomorrow. And what's interesting is to contemplate, Europe in particular, but really the rest of the world becoming kind of like a Medicaid, where on the one hand we're trying to eliminate or increase transparency and reduce the gross net spread with PBMs in the U.S., but we might go to a model where pharma is cutting deals with other markets with confidential contracts and other obscurities where you maximize that gross to net and you end up like Medicaid where you have a 50% effective rebate to bring you down to the actual.
I've heard this argument. Like I was at the BAML conference in Las Vegas this week or whatever. And I've heard this argument a lot, and I find it like plausible on the one hand. I guess the thing that I'm a little bit dubious of is that pharma companies are going to successfully manage to keep information from the U.S. government on this. And so, like, I'm a little bit dubious that whatever policy is passed is going to have a large enough loophole on pricing to allow people to like say, well, our list price with France is X, but like secretly we're giving them a 50% rebate that we're not telling the US about. So I'm a little bit worried about that line of reasoning, just because I think the government has ways, uh, and we're going to have to deal with those ways later, especially for US domiciled manufacturers where
Right.
the government gets all the information.
Yeah. So look, one of the things that I think is worth perhaps bringing up a little bit is where drug prices always much higher in the US than Europe or elsewhere. If you wind the clock back 20, 25 years, were they much higher? And I think the answer is no. And correct me if I'm wrong. And then, so to understand how we ended up where we are today, what changed in the process to create a world that managed to get itself into this massive divergence? In some cases, not in every case, there's a divergence, right? So people talk about net prices, etc. I think that applies a lot to drugs that go through standard pharmacy, but I'm pretty sure that the Keytruda isn't discounted at 50, 60, 70, 80%, for instance. I'm just picking up Keytruda for no reason. um, what happened in between? Part of it is because we're dealing with a free market, so therefore its pricing is set between players, and the government had not had an input. Whereas in Europe and most other countries, it is directly the government that negotiates. There are no middlemen. But if that's one part of the element, what else has happened here that has allowed this situation to occur?
Well, I
What?
mean, Sam, clearly one aspect of that is the role of PBMs and the discounts that they command and the rebates that they command, and how that affects U.S. manufacturer pricing at the end of the day. That is absolutely a factor here that creates more of a discrepancy in prices around the world.
Right.
The
But
US
John,
healthcare system
sorry.
is the
Go ahead,
only
Matt.
healthcare system in the world where basically no participant who has any control also wants prices low, right? Like, so obviously, pharmaceutical companies generally like higher price environments. Hospital systems, doctors, physicians, providers like higher priced environments. Insurance companies under the Affordable Care Act are capped on margin at about 15% by the medical loss ratio rules. So while shocks are bad for them, actually the only way an insurance company can go profit under the Affordable Care Act is increasing direct healthcare costs. So their actual incentive is to see a slow and steady rise of healthcare costs. And the one institution that actually is a concentrated, influential buyer of healthcare, the government, is, at least as far as drug prices are concerned, heavily restricted in its actual ability to negotiate. And so the US is the only country in the world, actually, where there is really almost nobody actually out there trying to keep prices down.
Right. So the solution here, of course, one of it is to give the government, which is what's happening as part of the IRA, give the government some ability to negotiate prices. But at the same time, something that now suddenly this week everyone forgot is not obviously not on this call, but when I've done endless interviews for the Bloomberg TV friends and radio, and it's just they forget that there's this net pricing, there's this middleman, there's this system in place. And also the fact that everybody forgets that the rest of healthcare is also more expensive in the US than it is in Europe. Nobody
Yes.
seems to question that. When I have a relative of mine who got flu and was hospitalized for 9 days in San Francisco, $250,000 bill, you will never see that here. Never. I mean, okay, it would be big, but it won't be $250,000. So when we look at these percentages of money for prescriptions drugs spent as a percentage of um, healthcare spend, in fact, you find that some European countries are higher than United States, but the pie is smaller. So the actual spend on drugs is lower. Um, so I can't I want to ask you this next. Do you see any way that by the end of this year we haven't had some pressure on drug prices one way or another, whether it's through the IRA, the next negotiation, or some other way?
I don't see it happening
So you
in
do
within the year. I
you,
don't see it happening.
you don't expect any price pressure, or you
I think that with all the things that have to get done to make a change like that, um, I don't see it happening.
okay? And Matt, Nina, do you want to make it not a wager, but a point here on this? Do you think by the end of 2025 there would have been some, not necessarily actual, but some negotiated prices that might kick in a year or 2 years?
I think there will be superficial negotiations by big pharma companies trying to forestall worse policy change along the same lines as what I would, this is maybe not a great thing to say publicly, but what I would call largely what I expect to be superficial guarantees of investment
Ah, yeah,
domestically.
yeah. We'll come to that.
Mm.
Very
Yeah.
good
I
point. We'll
think,
come to that.
and I think the places where this is most likely to happen are places where the writing is on the wall and there's going to be pricing pressure anyway.
Right.
And so I think, like, yeah, in the obesity space, I think we'll see a series of negotiated compromises to try and close the gap a little bit, because the truth is, like, between competition and other things, it's just coming anyway. So I do think, like, this year we will see some version of the grand gesture. Whether those grand gestures will have any ultimate impact to consumers or prices paid depends a little bit on whether it's like a promise to whatever the ideas of a plan versus an actual agreement, and also on like who's making those agreements and why. But I think we'll see something. Do I think
Mm.
we're going to see successfully implemented government scale MFN policy by the end of this year? I think if it can be achieved by executive order, we will see something. But I think mostly we think it can't.
No.
Uh, and I think otherwise, uh, it would be surprising to me if the legislature could get something through.
I
I mean,
completely
the
agree with that.
only I mean, the only executive order path would be through a CMMI demonstration project with Medicare, and that was proposed back in November of 2020 and was challenged and failed mostly due to process reasons. But even there, it would take a lot of time to implement it, and a lot of the guidelines for that would be challenged legally. So again, I think it's going to take a long time. see any of this get into the industry.
I do wonder
Yeah.
if we'll see. Sorry, go ahead, Nina.
No, please do finish your thought.
I just wonder if we're going to see actually the part of this that is ill circumscribed, difficult to sort of wrap your head around is like how the ways in which the government puts pricing pressure on drugs sold in the US are like relatively easy to imagine. The ways in which the government puts pressure on increasing drug prices overseas are harder to imagine. But I think that the current administration has shown us all some paths on which it's able to do things like that. And I do think we might actually see some of that activity this year. That is, if the government actually winds up caring about this issue and focusing on it, we may find out about bilateral negotiations around commitments on drug pricing and closing gaps uh, as part of broader trade bills, for example.
Right.
I think that's definitely a
So
possibility for
let me
trade agreements.
Nina, after you go ahead, Nina.
So I was just going to say that I think that outright price reform is unlikely to come, but I think the broader business pressures, unless maybe there will be some PBM reform legislated in a final budget, but aside from that, I don't think there'll be direct pricing impacts. The incorporation of Part B into IRA obviously has its possibilities. But I do think that there will be broader business pressures that are anti-innovation and that are difficult on the sort of pharma P&L, biopharma P&L.
Right. So I sat down with some of our colleagues here in Europe who are closely looking at these trade negotiations. And their view was there's no mechanism by which the US can put, apart from gentlemanly conversations or lady conversations, whatever the correct way of saying it is, um, into a trade deal because it's not actual trade. There is no, I mean, Europe doesn't buy the drugs that it sells in general from the US. So you can't really force Europe to raise its prices. And let's not forget, we are at the same time being forced to raise our um, that Europe being forced to raise its defense budget. There is a limit to which how much suddenly can start increasing. And with defense, the US had a lever that was, I am going to spend less. If you want NATO and your security to be as good as it was before, you're going to have to raise your numbers. Here, there is no other there is no lever except for if the companies start saying, okay, we're going to delist from from Europe, and in fact do what Matt said. You know what, not even drop our prices, raise our prices, which is politically awful, and I don't think it will happen, but that's the sort of thing that could go on. There's one other element here that my colleague Dwayne Wright has suggested. He said he thinks that the IRA sets a price ceiling but no floor. So referencing foreign prices, even though they're sort of lower levels, isn't a criteria in the IRA statute today, but it still allows them to take factors that aren't weighted. So providing what could be a wide latitude for the cuts. So they could push some of those through in November, which is 180 days, by the way, um, through the IRA, and at the very least declare some victory and move on.
I think the one issue there, Sam, is this administration is loath to do anything through a Biden
Yeah,
born pathway. And
good point.
I just think that there's going to be a lot of resistance from the administration on doing
Right.
something like that.
Let's talk about two more items here. Reimportation, the possibility, and then the reality. How likely is that? Buying it, bringing them in from Canada, shipping them over from Mexico, buying it in France and shipping over here to the US. But
I I
by
think it's
yeah,
I think it's a very low risk.
right.
I think it's a very low risk.
I think the silence was telling me that.
Yes, yes. I don't know if Matt and Nina agree, but I think it's a very low risk.
Yeah.
I think it
I'm
is, like many of these things, just much more likely to be a negotiating cudgel than an actual solution. But I think it's reasonably likely to be threatened as a part of the negotiation.
Yeah,
But
that favors the tariff debate, though.
it does. But
The
let me ask.
administration isn't going to tax their own imports of necessary medicines.
No, John, let me ask you this question. You're manufacturing drug as a line of X here in the US and also in Europe, would you, as a
Yes.
pharma company, allow sufficient volume in Europe to then be available for reimportation to the US? Because you
Of course
control that.
not.
But so that's the
Of course
problem,
not.
right?
Of course not.
Yeah.
Of
So
course not.
that is the biggest issue.
Yeah.
So, and the other one, of
Sorry,
course, is
that's not mechanically true, right? That is like you control it in the sense that you want to ensure adequate supply for Europe. And maybe in a world where the US allowed reimportation, you'd cut off supply for Europe. But if the price in Europe is X and the price in the US on list price is 2X and you can sell it for 1.5X here, people in the world have incentive to move it across the border. So like it's true again, it's true that you could cut off supply, or maybe European countries could like restrict exports because they want adequate supply. But the point remains that like enterprising people can move drug if allowed to do so.
as long as the
Yeah.
volume is there.
Yeah, if the volume is there, and then if there are no consequences for the country that's doing that, which may not be the case.
Yeah. So, and then the next question, of course, is the direct to consumer sales. Now, we've seen some already before this executive order comment, Lilly and Novo, Lilly Direct, etc. Now, how many types of drugs can you actually do that for? And how real is that? What are the barriers to that? I haven't even started to think about that part of it because it would be interesting to see if any companies actually step up and say, right, we're going to do this. Any thoughts there?
I think it's fairly unlikely. I think in the GLP-1 space, I think there is a supply chain management that needed to be resolved and somewhat of a referral base for patients to get prescribed. But I think the direct-to-consumer companies like a Hims or a Ro that actually have the sort of corporate practice of medicine air cover are servicing that need. And I think where pharma may continue to occasionally do it is for other ultra specialty products for orphan rare or vaccines where supply chain and timeliness is so critical. But I don't see a trend of biotechs or pharmas wanting to be in the business of practicing medicine and taking on the potential conflict risk of prescribing their own drugs.
Right. So I think we're nearly half an hour, half the way through, and this was the biggest topic this week. I would say that if I'm concluding everything you've said, is that legislation very tough by the end of the year. There may be some gestures either by the companies or some wins by the administration, which could come through some mechanisms, maybe through the IRA mechanism before the end of the year. But in reality, this is likely to fall into the same camp as the effort fell into last time round, um, which it
Before we leave
explains the.
policy, Sam, and I definitely don't want to obfuscate your moderation role, but I'd love to hear and a couple of other things that are in the big beautiful bill that touch on healthcare, and particularly from Matt and John, who are a bit more frontline operational. What their handicapping is of some things moving forward. I'm specifically interested in tax deductions for R&D in current year versus amortized over three, as well as potential elimination of tax deduction for advertising spend, and how that might effectuate or actually implement.
I mean, I'm going to let Matt cover it because I have not studied those deeply to personally. I don't know, Matt, if you have.
Not at the level of having. First of all, I think anybody who tells you they can predict inclusion in current government legislative proceedings is lying. Uh, but having said that, in terms of like R&D credit amortization,
Mm.
look, I think that's going to be just like a super heavily lobbied issue, to be honest, because
Yep.
this is not like there's going to be no layperson opinion on that. It's just going to be down to like the power of the respective tax lobbies versus the government policy, and I think we'll see. On the DTC piece, I guess first of all, my general view is as a as an instrument to try and affect the use of DTC advertising, tax policy is probably not going to be that effective. That is ultimately, if what you're doing is increasing by 25% or something the cost of all DTC advertising, I don't think that's likely to have a massive impact on most DTC spend. And so I think that is therefore possible, and I suspect in some places popular as an idea, so it could get included in some bill, but I don't think it's actually going to
Yeah.
have a big impact on how companies behave.
Yeah, I'm sitting in Connecticut, so I'll reference Chris Murphy's "No Handouts for Drug Advertisements" Act, where there's I believe it's Brookings. There's an analysis suggesting that from the 6 billion spent annually on direct-to-consumer advertising, 1.5 to 1.7 billion of tax revenue could be recouped. So it's not a trivial number um, that could implement. But
No, look, I think it may be a smart way for
yeah,
the government to raise $1.5 billion.
yeah,
I just think
yeah,
most of the people spending that $6 billion will spend
we'll still spend.
7.7 instead.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Fair,
Nina,
fair enough.
while you've got the mic there, did you want to also just touch on the orphan cures and maybe the PBM reform conversation?
Yeah, I think we touched a little bit on PBM reform, but there is some populist as well as congressional support for banning spread pricing and requiring more reporting of rebate amounts and pricing structures and contracts. Um, for the first time in my career in investing, I'm feeling sound bites from friends and family around PBMs as opposed to pharma being the only devil in the mix. So I think there may be something there, and also restrictions on steerage. One concern or conflict has been the ability of an integrated payer PBM being able to steer to their own, for example, mail order pharmacy, which may not be the lowest cost source. So I think there's a bit of analytical momentum behind that as well. And then on orphan, it's orphan cures there's been a lot of initiative, and I think it's fallen on pretty receptive ears. Certainly in the prior administration, but even in the new, to exempt orphan drugs from the Inflation Reduction Act negotiations. Um,
That was a
Not yet
big win. That was a big win.
big win, big win. It's not yet law, but it feels like it's got good bipartisan
Yeah.
support. And at least under the former FDA, there was also generally a lot of support for accelerated, R&D and innovation to incentivize drug development for orphan diseases. And hand in glove with that is an orphan drug tax credit, which historically had been 50%, was lowered to 25% for clinical expenses that could be deducted. And it sure would be nice to see that come back to 50%. And then there are other things that have been going on more on the regulatory versus on the policy side, where I think it's just going to be a little bit of time will tell to see how Macri and Prasad decide to implement. They don't both necessarily see eye to eye there.
No, there's a lot of that not seeing eye to eye, at least based on initial commentary before some of the folks came in. So we'll see how that pans out.
Yeah.
Um, it's interesting. So the other element, of course, on the overall picture here is the pledges made by pharma companies. We touched on that a little bit. I worked out just with the large pharma. The biggest, of course, the number was from Johnson and Johnson at 55 billion. So far, the smallest has been Merck at 9. These are very difficult to compare on an apple to apple basis because, as you saw today, the latest one to come up this week or yesterday or today was $20 billion from Sanofi. But you read the message and it says that we're looking at putting money in various things. So here it goes. It is 20 billion to 2030. Of the total investment, Sanofi will substantially increase spending in the US on R&D. That's ongoing R&D. That's not new capital expenditure to accelerate its science. The company also plans to expand its US manufacturing capacity. Fine. How much? I don't know. Right. As well as through partnerships, etc. While Sanofi's investment decisions will be adjusted as the external environment continues to evolve. Very interesting extra comment here. The planned investments are expected to create significant number of high-paying jobs in the United States across various states. So I think Roche also did the same thing. And interestingly, Roche came out and said, look, actually, if you want to go down that path with the most favored nation and pressuring us, the reason we want to invest more in the US is because it's where we make most of our profits and most of the research is being done. But if you then take away those profits, what's the incentive? They didn't quite say it like that, and I'm not sure how much should be attributed to Roche on this.
Well,
But
I
the
think
reality is it's
Sam,
complicated.
the direct quote was, should the proposed executive order go into effect, Roche's ability to fund the significant investments
Right.
previously announced in the US will be in question.
Yeah.
End quote.
And guess
That was
why?
pretty clear.
Guess why?
The
Yeah,
timing, the
because
timing was not
right.
inconsequential on the 14th.
No, no, but it's also it's critical because it's simply saying you're going to dwindle my cash flow. How can I do it?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there's no magic here, except if they are able to suddenly over the next 6 months raise all their prices across Europe. But that's not going to happen. These things take a long, long time. So, and I'm not convinced that these pledges are going to make a humongous difference in terms of new employment. We have seen numbers that they've suggested over 5 years. They end up being 2,000, 1,000, 3,000, which is great, right? But it's not the sort of the top line number looks a lot more interesting at $234 billion than the actual reality.
Well, and
Right.
we'll see where that $234 billion, ends up in actual dollars,
Mm,
because as has been said by some, including I think it was AbbVie CEO, a heavy lobbying for some tax relief in exchange for billions of investment. So some of those dollars may make a full circle back to industry,
yeah.
in addition
Which is
to helping to purchase some concessions on tariffs.
right.
And
Now, one way the fund and slowly moving on, I'm trying to segue to the next this discussion, that companies can manage their margins if this really hits hard is through productivity gains. And one way of gaining productivity gains across the entire industrials and non-industrials base is through AI. We've seen the CEO of the Norwegian Wealth Fund turn around and say that I'm not hiring any more people. That we're gaining 20, 30% efficiencies through AI, which is okay. It's a knowledge-based business, but many factories that if they ever come back to the US will probably be manned by, if you want to call it that, by robots. So it's not necessarily the fact that they're going to add employment, but AI is a big one. And Nikki, Nina, you wanted to pick up on the reckoning for AI drug discovery. That'd be an interesting comment, and of course, that's one sliver of what you could do with AI within the pharmaceutical chain. But do you want to take that up?
sure. And first, Sam, awesome segue to productivity. Well done. And I have to say, if, to the extent that I said AI reckoning, I probably should have put a question mark after it, because it was really a reflection of seeing the news of pipeline reorganization at Recursion on their first quarter call. In silico, seeking to go public again, maybe third time's a charm on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange to continue to fund their activities, and then in citro doing a 60-person 22% reduction in force for, again, team efficiencies. So the question, and particularly I think looking under the hood at Recursion, a lot of talented great people there, but this pipeline reorg came pretty quick on the heels, 6 7 months after they acquired Exscientia. And the discontinuations of 5 drugs includes several internal, but also several from that merger. So the question really is, and they announced a big lean in to analytics on the clinical development side to drive productivity in drug development, and not just in target and drug discovery. So the question, with 450 million of annual burn and 500 600 million dollars of cash, is there a bit of a existential moment, existential moment, if you pardon my pun. And similarly for trying to dip into the public markets for in silico shortly after they raised another 100 million Series E a couple months ago, and then in citro's cuts.
Yeah.
So believe there's huge power in the models, also predicated on tremendous integration and access to data, and then the repetitive recursive use of the models on the data to generate insights and productivity. But in this market, can you continue to do it at a scale where your burn rate is that high and your org is that large?
Right. I'm a huge fan of AI. I'm trying to see where can we increase our literally the word productivity, perhaps a bit overused, but double my capabilities. Let's put it that way. in terms of gathering information, analyzing information. Question I have, sorry, Matt, just one sec, I'll come back
Yeah,
to you.
sure. Go ahead. Yep.
Uh,
Yep.
the question I have, which is then you can delve into it, is this, are we, I remember the days of SNPs back in the late 90s. I remember of a company called Genset in Europe being the one where they had 100 sequences looking for SNPs, and they were going to solve everything. I'm just wondering to a degree whether we're at such an early stage of this, at the very early parts of drug discovery, of this application of this technology, that's simply what we're going through. And that in the end, it will all be part of the system and everybody will take it for granted. So Matt, over to you.
Yeah, two things. One is I really liked your segue, but how's this for a different segue, which is that pharma companies talking about use of AI is like pharma companies talking about making investments in the US.
Ah,
That is, it's a thing they feel obligated to do.
you're so cynical.
Well, I am to some degree. Look, we have a couple of efforts within Roivant on AI in various aspects of early stage discovery. We have a really good model for protein-protein interactions, and I think there's like tremendous promise in some of these tools. I think the sooner we can get away from like talking about AI, capital A, capital I, in quotes as like a thing, the more likely it is that we'll be able to make productive progress. Because I think right now it is like both a buzzword and a set of tools, and I think they kind of get in each other's way.
Mm.
I
Well
do think
I
said.
I
another
agree.
issue.
I agree a hundred
John, I
percent.
wanted to ask you actually, do you want to
Yeah.
add a little bit more to this? Because
Yeah. No.
what
I
about
do.
supply chain? What about manufacturing? What about
No, I think
all
they're
the stuff that
wonderful.
goes on there?
I think they're wonderful places to integrate AI into what a company does, whether it's on the discovery side, the clinical trial side, simulations, the whole nine yards. But it it's become a bit of a hype word, and I'm also cynical about how people think about it. As if it's a thing itself. And there's of course enormous overuse of the word when it's really just computation in some cases, not machine learning. So I think it's a great tool. It's a great tool, and we ought to be using it and embracing it, and we are as an industry, and it will help productivity. There's no doubt about that. But
Right.
we're far away from being able to type in a disease of interest and push a button and have a small molecule structure emerge from the computer that is the cure for that disease. We're very far away.
Right. You've said it now, so let's stop talking about it.
I think we're
the
onto something with this. I think computers are going to make a big impact on
Are
supply
they?
chain.
What
Computers,
about
yeah, I think they're going. I think they're going to
laptops and
matter.
Excel and
Compute, yeah, I think computers are going to be big for supply. I think someday every person working at a biotech company is going to have a computer on their desk.
wow. Okay, I
And
love that
it will be
prediction.
plugged into the internet.
Come on,
Amazing.
enough.
Yeah.
Let's talk about something that is actually that also happened. This another potential headwind, and that's the IRA Part B guidance from CMS. So who wants to take that? It really hit Halo hard.
Why don't you take it?
I'll take it. So obviously, but the issue here has been if you formulate a IV drug. I mean, this is the biggest issue that has been. I mean, there might be other versions of this that could be applicable. In my mind, if you formulate an IV drug with hyaluronidase to make it potentially subcutaneous and it works, and you spend quite a lot of time to convince the FDA that actually it's the same drug as the IV, and then you go to IRA Part B guide and say, actually, no, it's not the same drug. We should have an extension on this. It shouldn't be considered. Darzalex IV shouldn't be considered the same as Darzalex subQ. But you just spent all your time saying that it's bioequivalent. So one of my questions was always that is this not an obvious situation that's going to occur? Which of course then Merck's share price, because they're working on Keytruda subQ, and Johnson and Johnson's share price sold off on the back of this. It's an issue for both of them, and so now I'm wondering whether I've got this wrong, and actually that is a completely new drug, and it should have been considered as a new drug. So if anybody disagrees or agrees, just we could make your
I
comment, and then
I
we can go on.
honestly, I think it should be considered the same drug. I mean, it's the same active ingredient at the end of the day. And
Mm.
and I think we ought to just be honest about that at the end of the day. it's sort of hard to make the case scientifically that it's a different drug. It's formulated differently, it's presented differently. Um, it's got certain features that are good and beneficial and so forth. But it really is the same drug.
Mm.
It's called a spade a spade.
I mean, you're
And we
asked by
should
the
have a
regulator to
category
prove that.
for well, exactly, and but that's not always the case. I've had negative experiences with a very, very anecdotal development plan where we got pushback and told it this was not amenable to a 505(b)(2) and had to go a full-on randomized trial. But be that as it may, if it's going to be treated from a regulatory perspective as bioequivalent and substantially the same, even if it has some intellectual property insights that allow it to be novel, I think this is where we could use a category of super generics. There should still be some sort of premium to an IV generic for a product that increases convenience, reduces burden to the system, reduces cost, and potentially in so doing, increases, positive outcomes. But it probably shouldn't be that of an NCE.
That's an excellent point, and and I think in a single payer world, maybe people would take account of the fact that you're reducing physician time and physician costs, etc. But so be it. We'll find out in 2028 whether Darzalex or Keytruda, whichever one comes first, is hit by this. Now we had a few other stuff going on. Something very interesting this week, which was Galapagos wanted to do something, then changed his mind. So John, or Matt, do you want to take us through that?
I'm happy to. Or
Go ahead.
You go.
yeah,
You
look,
go.
I like this topic because there's been so, including on versions of the show that I've been on, like so much discussion of these like companies trading under cash or cash trapped in companies, and I think Galapagos is such an interesting example of the thing because we've sort of gotten to watch the whole thing play out in a very public and specific way. And I remember it was early. So the thing that happened this week is Galapagos had previously been planning to spin out a effectively like a cell therapy program under its former CEO Paul Stoffels into a new co, or I think actually they were going to spin the rest of the thing into a new co and leave that as called Galapagos. But either way, they're now sort of second guessing that decision and have changed out leadership for Henry, uh, um, most recently of Neumora, and are sort of pushing forward, trying to figure out what to do. The thing that I think is interesting about this is so I remember being in a room with the form like the original CEO of Galapagos, Ono, back in it was I think early 2020, and he was so excited about the deal they had done with Gilead, rightly so, because it had brought in I think it was like $5 billion in cash. But also he was like fiercely committed to the idea of Galapagos as an independent platform company running forever on its own two legs without being gobbled up by some form of behemoth. And the deal with Gilead, he was finally confident had like forever secured Galapagos's independence. That between the obligations to give Gilead U.S. rights for programs and and the sort of standstills and things like that that stopped Gilead from being an acquirer, that the company was like assured its independence. And I think one thing we can confidently say is that succeeded,
Yeah.
and that now with the business largely no longer in any of that form, it still has all of these obligations that render it complex. And I think it's one of these things where whatever it's like a very beautiful picture of laws of unintended consequences, where we now have this sort of shadow of its former self organization with a whole bunch of cash that could be used productively, trapped in a sort of interstitial zone between public biotech company and Gilead affiliate. And I've just found it really interesting to watch from the outside.
Matt, do you think there was anything to do with the new head of CBER announcement, who has been very clear about questions about cell therapy and particularly about using surrogate markers, at least in some settings, for approvals?
I don't.
Or am I
It
reading
would
too much into it?
it would surprise me a little bit if look. I think the path started with they decided to work on these cell therapy programs. Stoffels was really excited about them. The public markets it has not been friendly to companies of that kind for a while. And so I think like they got on this path and then they sort of realized we're going to fund this thing with $500 million. It's going to need more than $500 million. We're just like setting this thing up to have a difficult trajectory. Then Stoffels left. Uh, And I think he left kind of before the CBOR change, I think, or maybe right around the same time, but it must have been planned for longer than that. And so, I think the company was sort of left a little bit leaderless with a really tough market reception for a program that I don't think the street was particularly excited about for the most part. Um, and then it can't help that the stance on cell therapy gets even stricter, and at a minimum is going to make this company even less
Right,
popular as an independent public company. So I'm
right,
sure it was a
Yeah.
notionally contributing factor, but I doubt it was the thing in and of itself.
right, right. Now, so actually, this brings us to other turnarounds, and one of them was CytomX, which presented some data for an EpCAM directed ADC, which has got a TROP2 on it. Sorry, topoisomerase on it, and say CX2051. Market cap currently is $312 million. The stock traded at 43 cents on the 7th of April. So whoever's out there who was brave to buy it at those prices should pat themselves on the back, because current share price is $2, having touched $2.50, because of relatively positive data that came out of this. And they immediately on the back of it raised $100 million. So, this company had traded below cash for 3 years. I think Galapagos probably beats it. I'm not sure. I haven't done the comparison. But this phase one data in late line CRC, according to our analysis, looks pretty good. And frankly, just in the third line market currently is worth about $1.1 billion in the US. And there are products out there who are looking very good, but this brings a completely different mode of action. And of course, this is just CRC. Where else can it work? And it does use the CytomX technology. So it's nice to see companies be able to, in some cases, continue and actually deliver. This is a technology that I think a lot of people had given up on.
Yeah.
You know, but
Sam, I want to concur with that. I mean, first of all, kudos to Sean McCarthy, who stuck with it all these years as the CEO, and kept with it, and it's wonderful to see the result, and it's also wonderful to see the market respond to good data. So,
yeah.
that's a piece of happiness in the week. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, and we had
Yeah,
another
and heavily
little.
pre-treated CRC has been,
It's
such
absolutely.
a bear, and we're not seeing much of anything. And I think the other thing that the Cytomics did a good job of, I think, in reporting this, and the waterfall looks really quite nice with quite a few responders,
Hmm.
is they also really help to kind of re-elaborate some evidence-based epidemiology on FCAM and other solid tumors as well. So I think there's perhaps a little bit of renaissance to the target, unlike another one
Absolutely.
we'll talk about.
Absolutely. And I
Yeah.
suspect you'll
Yeah.
need the pro body or masking or something to manage the AEs. So and now
Yeah.
we also had an M&A deal for a company that was close to cash or below cash. John, and Nina, did you want to talk about the Bimarine, which was today or yesterday? I can't remember now.
Yeah, no, it was today, this morning.
Yes.
I don't know much about the target company, but it was good to see Bob Marin out there, executing on its business development objectives. James Sabry was brought in by Alexander Hardy, a couple years now, maybe a year ago, and he's doing his work. He's doing his job. He's going out finding assets, and this certainly fits in the Bob Marin story. So it was good to see them go out there, be a buyer, and bring some technology and pipeline into the company.
Yeah. Nina or Matt?
I was going to make a remark across both of these situations, which is as a public CEO, one of the things you start to feel is a little battered by the markets over time. And in particular, I feel like our industry operates at times like investors as a class are the sort of ultimate tastemakers. And yet, I think if you look at many success stories in industry, they have stock charts that look like these two stock charts. That is, they went through long periods where they were violently out of favor, and then they, in one way or another, proved everyone wrong. And I think it's like a good reminder.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, So the other deal that we had, which isn't quite an acquisition, it was GSK buying a drug from Boston, and that was a $1.2 billion upfront and $800 million in contingent milestones. The drug is efimosfermin. God, they're hard drugs. They're for MASH and liver issues. So And there are a couple of companies out there which are comparatively differently valued. So 89 Bio has got an enterprise value of 514 million with a drug in phase 3, and Effie is in phase 2. And there is Akira, of course, with 2.4 billion. Now, with another similar drug, with efruxifermin, that's also in phase 3. There's been a lot of discussion along the clients that I've been tuned into about whether this is a good asset or not a good asset. What is interesting about it is that this is the second time that Glaxo's bought an asset or a drug or a company where the drug was licensed in. The last time it was a drug that was licensed in like 6 months beforehand from China. This time, and I can't remember the name of the company, and this time it's been a while. It was 2020, I think, that this drug came from Novartis. So interesting that it fits in with the MASH franchise that I think GSK is trying to come into. They've got an RNA interference drug in phase 2 also. We think the profile looks decent. I don't know if anybody else has had a look at it or thinks about this therapeutic area.
I mean, I think it looks decent as well. I think the FGF21 story is going to be an important part of the MASH story. There's no doubt about that. I also think it's great that MASH is becoming a new black all of a sudden after being very disfavored. But we're seeing a lot of, obviously, I think the Madrigal success has been illuminating the commercial potential in the space. And now we're seeing some exciting assets. Like the FGF21 story, and then some very exciting assets on the RNA interference side, including the program that GSK has got called targeting HSD17B13, which is a phenomenal genetic target in MASH. So lots of fun there, I think, and lots of movement, and of course the impact of GLPs in the space is also going to be important. So
Yeah.
it's going to be fun to
Yeah,
see this play out.
Nina?
nothing to add.
Okay, but I mean, I think they might have used some computers to identify that genomic target in the
There might have
process,
been one or
right?
two, one or two.
Hooked up to the internet.
That's right. Yeah. So, of course, talking about RNA interference, RNA, siRNA, etc., we had 2 deals this week. One with a US company, one with a South Korean company. And John, if anybody's got to talk about these things, it's got to be you.
I guess so. I guess so. Well, there were two interesting deals. One I think obviously much bigger was the AbbVie partnership with a private company called 8RX. And 8RX is a super cool company led by a former R&D person from Arrowhead, female CEO, awesome leader. And they did a deal, 335 million upfront with AbbVie. This is AbbVie's first jump into RNAi as well, which is good to see. And obviously a multi-target deal from what I can glean from the press release across multiple areas, immunology, oncology, neurology were the areas that were noted in the press release. And so it'll be good to see all that play out. It's obviously a good source of capital for 8RX. And then the second deal I know much less about. RZnomics is the name of the company in South Korea. It seems to be around RNA editing, but unclear, I must say, from the press release. But it is in the field of hearing loss, and that's an area that Lilly, of course, has been really keen on with some pretty impressive success through their gene therapy efforts. But this is now a different way of tackling it. A lot of the financial details were masked in that um, announcement. It's unclear what the upfront was, for example, and so forth. So might be a
Right.
small deal, but it's good to see this deal making happening across the industry, and I'm always happy when it's happening in the RNA world.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole bunch. Thank you, John, for that. There's a whole bunch
Yeah.
of other comments, things that we could have talked about, but let me just do a round robin. Nina, anything to
Just
add?
wishing, wishing everyone a great weekend and
Yeah.
continued good fight and in delivering good things for patients.
And let's hope that we don't have as eventful a Monday as we did this week. So, Matt,
I'm tempted to make some comment about On Island being a great company, but I'm good. No, this was a fun conversation. I appreciate it. Looking forward to doing it again sometime.
well, it's only fun when we have John and Matt and Nina type folks on.